Let's talk about another great preacher tonight. We're going to talk about the Apostle Paul. I want you to remember now, we're going to talk about Paul before Festus. You see that picture? Does it look familiar? I use the same picture when we're talking about Paul before Felix. Let me remind you what happened. Acts chapter 24, the proconsul that was over Judea has come to Caesarea, and he sent for the Jews in Jerusalem to come to Caesarea and bring their charges against Paul. Well, the high priest came with the Jews, and they charged Paul with many things. And when it came time for Paul to make his defense, he made an able defense, and the proconsul could find nothing against him. Well, let me tell you what's going to happen in this chapter. The proconsul in Caesarea is going to send for the Jews to bring their charges against Paul. They're going to come with the high priest, and they're going to level their charges against him, their accusations. And when the proconsul allows Paul to speak, he'll make an able defense, and the proconsul will find nothing against him. It's the same story, isn't it? The difference is the characters have changed. Now, it was right about the time that Paul came to Jerusalem that Nero had replaced Claudius as the Caesar. I went back and looked this up to see if I could get these Caesars correct. You remember the Caesars? There was Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And Nero had just become Caesar right about the time Paul went to Jerusalem. And, you know, it takes a while for an emperor to get all things in order. And with all the trouble he was hearing out of Judea, after about 2 years, he'd replaced Felix for Festus. And so now Festus comes, and he's in Felix's place. And the thing that the Bible does not tell us, that the historians tell us, is that Ananias was no longer high priest, but he had been replaced by a high priest by the name of Ishmael. And so you've got Nero sitting on the throne, and now you've got Festus in Caesarea, and you have Ishmael as the high priest, and Festus had just arrived. Now, if anything about Felix seems like to me, as corrupt as he was also a procrastinator. He did not deal with the problems, and that's one of the reasons he had to be replaced. And so if anything, Festus comes in, and he's the exact opposite of that. As soon as he hits the ground running and said, well, we got problems, let's bring them up, let's figure them out, let's solve them, and let's move on. And that's what we're going to see with this proconsul. Now, we're going to be looking for these things. It says in Acts 24, as we ended, after 2 years, Porcius Festus came in Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Felix knew he was in a dilemma. If he had sent Paul to the Jews to be killed, it would have pleased the Jews, but it wouldn't have pleased the Romans because he would have violated Roman law. And so if he let Paul release, it would have pleased the Romans because they had no charge against him, but it wouldn't have pleased the Jews that wanted him put to death. He did a compromise that pleased no one. Just left Paul in prison for 2 years, and we're going to see that did not satisfy the Jews. Festus was coming to the province, and after 3 days, now he arrives, and after 3 days, it didn't take him long, he makes his trip from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now, there'd been many things under Felix that the Jews would have wanted to lay their complaints before Festus on the problems and what to do about this. I think it's remarkable that of all the things the Jews could have brought up, it sounds like one of the first things they brought up was this prisoner that they had in Caesarea, Paul, and they wanted him put to death. It says, then the high priest and the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem lying in the way to kill him. That's what they wanted to do. Get Paul back out on the road and kill him somewhere in between Jerusalem and Caesarea. Hire those assassins back and get them to take Paul out. Well, Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Says, well, I'm not going to bring him here. Let's take care of him at Caesarea, and I'll see about it there. So, we've got Festus and Paul, called by name, and Caesarea and Jerusalem, the places. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. Doesn't that sound familiar? And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting in the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. Again, you see this Festus, he doesn't wait around. He said he'd do it. He get next day, let's bring Paul up and have these Jews accuse him. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many grievous complaints against Paul. Remember, their complaints were personal in that he is a pest. And then they were political in that he's a ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes. He's going to cause the ruling authorities trouble. And then religious in that he was defiling the temple. And they're bringing these kind of charges against Paul again, but they could not prove them. You would think that after 2 years they would have known that just accusations are not going to work. They needed to provide some proof, but proof they did not have. So while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended in anything at all. That's Paul's defense. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Why to Jerusalem? Well, what would change? Wasn't his accusers there? Wasn't he being tried before Festus now? Looks like Festus knew he had a dilemma. And here he's the new guy on the street, and maybe he didn't know exactly what to do. The Jews had wanted him to Jerusalem. Well, maybe just try to put yourself in his place. Maybe he was thinking, oh, that'll pacify the Jews if we try him in Jerusalem and take care of it there. Paul was having none of this. We're going to read now about Caesar. Remember, we mentioned Caesar. This Caesar now is the Nero Caesar. He's standing in Caesar's judgment hall. And that's what Paul said. I stand in Caesar's judgment seat. Paul knew his Roman law. He says, this is where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I've done no wrong, and thou knowest very well. He said, Festus, you know better than this. I'm a Roman. I'm to be tried by Romans in a Roman court. I'm not going to be tried by you in a Jewish court. And really, he had no authority in a Jewish court. Anyway, Festus didn't. This was a Roman issue with a Roman court. Now, you're the judge responsible, and you know that. And I'm not going to go to Jerusalem with you. He said this. This is an interesting statement. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. If the punishment's coming to me, I'll take it. I'm going to turn to that a little bit later. But if none of these things whereof these men accuse me, no man can deliver me unto them. And then he said, I appeal to Caesar. Now we have this in the Greek language, but it's very likely that Paul spoke this in the Latin language. That was the official judicial language of the Romans, And Paul probably used that that Latin expression that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but there is a special expression you make that says, to Caesar, I make my appeal. And that made it official once you said that. Now, after 2 years, you wonder, why did he wait 2 years to do this? And we don't really know what all's going on. There's political changes happening around Paul. There is danger involved. You're putting your hands now in the hand of the Romans, and you kind of lose control of your life if you go before Caesar. There may have been several things why Paul did not. But now he sees, look, we got a new high priest. We got a new proconsul. Nothing has changed. I'm going to make the change. It's kind of like you've heard the fellow said he had the ace up his sleeve. He had the trump card that he was holding on to. He knew how to change the whole nature of the game here. And now he thought it's time to pull that out, play that hand, and it really changes the whole situation. So Paul made his appeal as a Roman citizen, according to his rights, to be judged in Rome by none other than Caesar himself. Well, then Festus, when he'd conferred with the council, answered, Thou hast appealed unto Caesar shalt thou go. I can just see Festus, where he calls his councils to him, so, well, what do we do about this? Can he do that? Making sure it's right, and then come back to the bench, and almost like he's bringing down the gavel here. I don't read a gavel, but you can almost hear a gavel clap when he says, Thou hast appealed unto Caesar thou shalt go. Court dismissed type of thing. And so Paul has his appeal, and now he's going to go before Caesar. Well, after certain days, Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to salute Festus. Agrippa had been appointed king over Galilee and over Jerusalem. And so these men were going to have to work together. They're both under the auspices of Rome, and their authorities overlap. So, of course, Agrippa would come down and meet the new proconsul, and he brought with him Bernice. Now, I want you to go back and remember Felix and Drusilla. Do you remember who Drusilla was? She is the daughter of Agrippa the First. Do you remember who he was? He is the one that had James beheaded and had imprisoned Paul, a grandson of Herod the Great. This Agrippa was Agrippa the Second, the son of that same Agrippa the First. And that made Drusilla and this King Agrippa brother and sister. But now let me introduce you to Bernice. She was the other sister. You see, Drusilla and Bernice were sisters, and both of them sisters to Agrippa. And the thing was, Bernice had married an older man and had left him and had returned to her brother and was living with her brother. And there's 1 year of age difference between them, and the word was out that they were living in incest. And it was quite a scandal at the time. It's also interesting to me that historians tell us that both Drusilla and Bernice were very beautiful and known for their beauty. There's something in that Herod line that made those Herods, they were fine-looking people as far as outward appearance, but inward, they were rotten and corrupt, as evil as they come. Well, now here they are, and this somewhat scandalous relationship. You'd think a brother and sister ought to be able to live together, and that would be fine. But this is not just living together. There was something else going on here that made this quite scandalous. Well, they come, and they came to Caesar to salute Festus. And when they'd been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case to the king, saying, There's a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So now we've got Festus, Paul, Caesar, Agrippa, and Bernice. Verse 16, to whom I answered, it is not in the manner of Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and to have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Now that's legal talk, isn't it? That it is corrupt as these governing officials were. Their corruption is kept in check somewhat by the fact that they honored Roman law. He said, therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accuser stood up and brought none accusation of such things as I suppose, but had certain questions of him of their own superstition. Now that's what Festus thought about religion. He had no religion. It's just all superstition. And these Jews, he thought of them, they're just superstitious. And then he says, and of one Jesus, called him by name, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Put yourself back in Festus' seat again. This all appeared to him just absurd, ridiculous, that none of this is making any sense to me. And so Agrippa, you know these people, maybe you ought to hear him out and help me here think this thing through. And so we've got Jesus mentioned by name in this account. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged by these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Augustus. Okay, remember your Caesars? Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Why is this Augustus? Well, just like the name Caesar had followed these men, when they become the emperor, they start calling them the Caesar. The name Augustus means the august one, the great one. And it was Octavius that was first called Augustus, Octavius Caesar, the august one. And so he took that as a name for himself, Augustus Caesar. And all the Caesars that followed wanted to be an august one also, particularly Nero. He wanted them to worship him as a god. And so they're bestowing upon him these names of honor that the other Caesars had had. And that's why the hearing of Augustus says, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. So we're going to put out beside Caesar here now, Augustus Caesar. But no, this is not Caesar Augustus. This is Nero. Now you might know something about Nero. In fact, the very name is the name of a villain. Nero was a madman. And why would Paul think he would present himself before such a madman as Nero? And the reason was, when Nero first became emperor, he was not a madman. He was very egotistical, and everyone knew that, but it had not yet turned to madness. And even though he was an egomaniac, he was governing very well. In fact, some historians call those first years of Nero as Caesar, count that as the golden years of the Roman Empire. But this Nero gained such power, he had no power higher than him. He wanted to be worshiped as a god. When he got as high as he could, he just went crazy. It's like all the power went to his head, and all the evil elements of him began to spill out. But they had not yet done so at this time. And so Agrippa said to Festus, I would hear the man myself, and again, tomorrow you shall hear him. Say, oh, that's Festus. Let's get it done. Okay, we'll do it tomorrow. It certainly gave Paul no time to prepare himself for what was about to occur. Well, on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp. Can't you just see this, a judgment hall? And now I present to you, and here comes Augustus. And now we'll present you, and here comes Bernice. I mean, all of them coming in with all the great royalty seated before them, coming in with this great pomp, almost ceremonially. It was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city at Festus' commandment. Paul was brought forth, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man about whom the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found he had committed nothing worthy of death, notice that. Every time Paul gets a fair trial, he's found not guilty. And he'd been found not guilty again. I found he'd committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus. I've determined to send him, of whom there are no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. I don't know what to say. Why is he going to Caesar? I don't really understand the charges against him, and I don't think he's done anything wrong. What should I write? It seemed to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Okay, Bradley, we've set you up. The next chapter is a very full chapter. I looked at it and I thought, boy, Bradley's got a lot on him to be able to cover this next chapter, but he will do it. And I'm going to let him cover that then when the time comes. Probably not next week, but the week after that, he will cover this next chapter, chapter 26 with Paul. Well, what do we learn from all of this? And I'll present two things that we ought to keep in mind. And one is that statement Paul made, if I have done something worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Indirectly, Paul is affirming the legitimacy of a death sentence. Now, there are those that think, well, should the government put people to death? He wrote in the book of Romans to the Rome that God gave them that power, the power of the sword, to yield that sword. And here again, Paul is affirming that the government has the right to put people to death. And so you have him indirectly now, but he's affirming the legitimacy of a death penalty when it's properly imposed. The second thing that I think we need to take note of here, Paul, being a Roman citizen, would use the legal rights that he had as a Roman citizen. And that's something we can look at too. We're very fortunate that we live under such a government as we have. And we know there's corruption among those officials, but there's a law, and the law that is in place somewhat deters the corruption that we would otherwise see. And as citizens of our country, we have rights. And it is not an evil thing to stand up for your rights and to use what by right is yours. Now, under Paul's system, the idea was that the government gave you rights. You know, under our system, we see that the rights come from God. And we, with our rights, allow the government to rule. It's a government of the people rather than the government of the kings. It's a different situation with us, but either way you look at it, we have God-given rights. And it's certainly appropriate for us to exercise our rights. Now, there are times we can forego our rights for the sake of some greater cause. But we cannot accuse a man of doing anything wrong when he's simply doing what is his right to do. And Paul exercised his rights and teaches us we can do the same thing. I tell you, Paul has appealed to a high court. It would be the Supreme Court of the Roman law to be able to go before Caesar. And there was no appeal from Caesar, except there's a greater law than Caesar. We have the greatest judge. We can bow in prayer at any time and carry our case before our Father which is in heaven. It'll be heard by Jesus Christ himself, who's above all principality and power and might in every name that is named, not only in this world, but that which is to come. All power given unto me in heaven and on earth. Now that's the ultimate appeal. And Paul had that as well. And we have that as well. Don't you want to stand before God when you come before him in judgment as one of his children? I know that I do. And so now I'm going to extend the invitation. If any need to be baptized into Christ, to become a child of God, being born again into this greater spiritual kingdom, you have the opportunity to do it as we stand and sing.